Ladies, gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, Elden Ring has quite a lot of interesting mechanics, and personally one that I find extremely intriguing is statuses. There are 7 of these if you want to be strict, 10 if you're a little bit looser, and these have wildly different use cases and viability. This was true in the base game, of course, and this is even more so true in the DLC, as the developers just seem to have made this content with the full knowledge of exactly how many different ways that players use the systems of the base game to just trivialize the content. That said, today we're going to just have a discussion about all of the statuses and rank them from worst to best in the context of additional content of the DLC, and generally speaking, their relevance to the DLC stuff as well. At the bottom of the pile then, deathblight. This builds up a status bar, and when full, you die. Simple as that. That said, this has zero meaningful effect in PvE, only affecting NPC invader encounters specifically, and so you'd think maybe with Shadow of the Erdtree having a big slog of an encounter near the end that is essentially group invasion PvP with a bunch of NPCs, it might do something, but of course they are immune to deathblight. This is a PvP only status for all intents and purposes, which is sad in itself, but past that there is just no way to consistently build this up, honestly, in any way that actually matters. It is thematically fun, but functionally very much pointless outside of when, bugs happen, like with Fire's Deadly Sin in the base game, or the week that we had of Nanaya's Torch in the DLC applying deathblight like crazy. There's just no real way to make an effect like this that either does nothing or instantly kills you feel actually balanced, and so it must stay significantly underpowered to actually make any sense. Second to last then is poison, basic poison. This scales its buildup with your arcane stat, so applying it is fairly easy, but the stat doesn't affect the actual damage of the effect. It simply is what it is, and that is a very small amount of flat damage as well as some maximum health percentage drain per second. This effect lasts for 90 seconds and does just a bit over 6% maximum health as damage over the duration. It's a cool concept, absolutely useless amount of damage though, especially in the DLC where the flat damage number is so low compared to enemy health bars that you aren't even getting much from that passive health percentage, which, to put it in the simplest of terms, killing an enemy that has 40,000 health, which is actually pretty standard middle of the road remembrance boss health in the DLC, would take a bit more than 12 and a half full poisons, or just over 19 minutes. Yeah, 19 minutes. And while there are things like the Kindred of Rot's Exaltation Talisman or the Mushroom Crown Helmet that give you damage boosts after a poison is triggered nearby you, and that lasts for 30 seconds, poison can only be built up once it is removed, so the 90-second duration means that you only actually have those buffs active about 30% of the time. Again, it's thematically cool, relatively pointless though. However, there is deadly poison, which we will be getting to a bit later on. After this I have sleep, basic, just tiny sleep. The effect is neat, multiple stages depending on the enemy, either a long 30-second stun where you can get a special crit animation on them while they're grounded, or just a 2-second or so stun that is instantly interrupted if they receive more damage. Most bosses are either fully immune to this status or only receive the mini stun version of it. None give you the actual full massive just sleep period. This especially applies in the DLC though, where the only remembrance boss that I've even managed to put to sleep to begin with is Rolana. None of the other ones even seem at all susceptible, which, like deathblight, leaves the main purpose, especially in the DLC, to be PvP. In this case, it's not bad, but the ways of applying sleep are very, very limited, and you can't scale the build-up outside of using soporific grease on the Ripple Halberd, which for some reason actually makes it scale up with arcane. The effect on players then is the mini stun, but it breaks the second they take damage, making sleep more of a companion piece rather than something that you can build at all around. Past that though is the new and improved version of this, which is Eternal Sleep, exclusive to the DLC. This is found on the Velvet Sword of St. Trina, Tolier's Hidden Needle, and also on weapon greases too. These methods aren't actually the worst. The build-up rate is slower than normal sleep, as you might expect in pretty much every comparison possible, but the effect is actually a fair bit stronger. On smaller NPCs, you can put them to sleep literally forever, like they will never wake up again. You can hit them to death and they won't wake up. You can walk away, come back 20 minutes later, as long as you don't actually reset stuff, they'll still be there, asleep permanently. Then there are the tiers that it has, like basic sleep, with one being a 60-second duration stun, where you can actually just sort of wail on them for the first few seconds of it before waking them up, and then you get a free crit window as well. Then the final stage being a mini stun, like regular sleep has, but unlike regular sleep, damage won't break the stun effect, meaning you can really wail on an enemy for the full 3-second window. This is also the stage that applies to PvP, and it means if you can predictably apply Eternal Sleep to a player, they'll basically just be dead, because you'll know when to keep comboing after your attacks. Again though, minimal use on bosses, only actually remembrance boss in the DLC that it applies to is Rolana, so that's why this is so far down still, despite deathblight being notably better. Then we have Madness, and this one is sort of funky now. This one is on a similar wavelength to deathblight, only really applying in PvP, as the majority of PvE enemies have no effect with this. But when it triggers on an enemy, Madness will deal 15% of their maximum health as damage, rip away some of their FP bar, and get you a mini stun that functions basically how Eternal Sleep does. In PvP, Madness is just better than Sleep and Eternal Sleep, and in PvE, Sleep does have some more use, some enemies that it can affect, but very, very little, honestly. Madness, on top of that, you have to give a little bit of credit for being a part of the new insane damage buildup method of just stacking a ton of different things that boost your damage when Madness happens nearby, and then giving it to yourself. But I don't really consider that a strength of the status itself, so much as the gear they added in the DLC. The thing is, on top of this just being a better effect for the most part, there's a couple of really ridiculous new weapons with this effect as well. My personal favorite being the Matting Hand Fist Weapon, which just has insanely quick build-up because it is fist weapons as well, and the unique skill has a touch of hyper armor and basically instantly applies madness, so you can trade with enemies to just get a madness application and then whack them in the face. It just lets you beat enemies up a ridiculous amount. It's super good as a madness weapon if you like that idea for PvP. Past that, we're moving back into the realm of things that also apply to the PvE side of the game with Scarlet Rot. There are tons of ways to apply Scarlet Rot, but there is an important distinction between the versions of Scarlet Rot that is applied with weapons, and the version that is applied with incantations. Weapon Scarlet Rot does around 16% of an enemy's maximum health over 90 seconds, with a bonus chunk of flat damage as well. This is quite literally nearly 3 times the potency of poison, though there are limited ways to apply this, and generally speaking, while few bosses are immune to Scarlet Rot, most of them will take quite a lot of hits to actually have this apply. But it is a great sort of companion status, something that you have but don't build around, especially when you get into the second version of Scarlet Rot, the incantation version. This one instead does around 30% maximum health over 90 seconds with another chunk of flat damage, and to compare these to the numbers that I gave you for poison earlier, Weapon Scarlet Rot would kill a boss with 40,000 health in around 7 minutes and 40 seconds, whereas Incantation Rot would kill the same boss in around 4 minutes and 40 seconds, which is honestly just remarkably fast, considering that isn't counting any other sources of damage. These also trigger things like the Mushroom Crown and Kindred of Rot's Exaltation talismans, but do have the same problem of only getting the buffs active for 1/3 of the duration. And in fact, that doesn't have this problem then, though, is the third strongest status on the list, Deadly Poison. You could absolutely argue that Incantation Rot specifically is maybe stronger, though not Weapon Rot, but the difference is usually Scarlet Rot is used as a companion piece, something that you stick on and then fight normally, whereas Deadly Poison is much more actually usable as a proper build focus. This effect is just over 4% maximum health and a bit of bonus flat damage as well, done over only 30 seconds instead of 90. This is only applied by a few select weapons, the Serpent Bone Blade, the Venomous Fangs, and the new Poisoned Hand Fist Weapon and Poisoned Perfume Bottle as well. To compare it to the previous damage over time status numbers, on a boss with 40,000 health, this would take 9.5 minutes to kill them solely on its own. This is less than either versions of Rot, but specifically important because it only lasts for 30 seconds each time, the exact timer of the buffs from the helmet and talisman that I keep mentioning. This means that you can make a very coherent build completely around this status. PvP, PvE, doesn't really matter. It has limited sources to apply it, sure, but every one of them is actually good in their own right, so if you'd like poison, this is the way to go with it really. And worth mentioning, you can use a Scarlet Rot incantation in a Deadly Poison build and apply both of these at the same time to just watch things melt. Then we have our final 2 slots, the big ones really. These are very debatable between the two, but I'm going to lean a little bit harder on which one I think is the better status overall here rather than the builds that surround them. That said, in second we have Blood Loss. This one applied just does a chunk of damage depending on the enemy's maximum health, with a very small amount of flat damage on top of that. On regular enemies this is 15%, on most bosses though it is just over 10%. To put that simply, 10 bleed procs will kill 99% of bosses in the entire game, even if you do no other damage at all. On top of that, it is probably the most buildable status, being able to scale on any weapon with natural arcane, or anyone that you add arcane scaling to that has natural bleed buildup as well. It has a helmet that buffs you when a bleed happens nearby, a talisman that buffs you as well. There's even a food buff now in the DLC that gives you a buff when a bleed happens, and a great rune as well, specifically to boost spirit summons if a bleed happens. It just has so many different layers to it, a ton of ways to actually apply it, and a number of those are just insanely strong. Whether you use bleed as your main source of damage, which you absolutely can, or as a fuel for more damage from whatever your main choice is, mostly physical damage usually, you can't really go wrong with having some form of bleed in your build, especially with the DLC not really having much bleed immunity going on inside of it. The only reason that I have the second then instead of first is usually if you're going to use bleed, you pretty much are going to be using it constantly, so it has to be an actual focus of your setup, as opposed to the first place entry, Frostbite. This status is just insanely good on its own. On application, it does 10% of most enemies, maximum health is damage, 7% to bosses, so lower numbers than bleed does, but the secondary effect is the really big one here, reducing your enemy's damage negation by 20% for 30 seconds. That is a massive amount, and holds its own unique place as a debuff that lets you stack it with other things as well to do even more damage to an enemy. Not to mention there are tons of ways to apply this debuff, and no real ways to actually increase its buildup, which means that you don't really usually focus this as a whole build around frostbite because you can't really. You just get one solid way to apply it, keep it active for the debuff and occasional health chunking while using a different build basically. Then it just makes anything else that you're actually wanting to use stronger. The one exception to this is running frostbite and fire damage together. You can cancel frostbite's lingering debuff with any source of fire damage applied, which then makes it act essentially as a lesser version of bleed. Thematically it's cool, it's fun to play around with, but at that point you're just doing less damage per proc than a bleed build is, getting less status buildup than a bleed build would, and having less ways of boosting your damage from these procs happening than bleed would due to they're just not actually having character damage boosts on frostbite procs. The sort of exception to that used to exist was combining frostbite with blood flame, which essentially was fire, ice, and bleed all at once together, and this let you build the statuses up separately, which was really cool. But blood flame got a pretty hefty nerf a while back, and since then it's just been a lot worse. Basically, don't use fire to cancel frostbite unless you're just doing it because you think it's fun. It's not very effective. The true power of frostbite comes from the lingering debuff that stays on enemies rather than the application itself. That just about does it for today then everyone, just a full ranking of the different statuses in Elden Ring, both including any new mechanics or interactions with them thanks to the release of the DLC, as well as how they actually fare against the bosses within Shadow of the Erdtree. I hope you've enjoyed this and hopefully this information helps you in your journey of making fun builds. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.